And so we are joining today to meet Andrew Feiler, who will explain how he traveled 25,000 miles in 3 years, photographed 105 Rosenwald schools. He's a very talented man, as I have begun to learn. He's very civic-minded. He's done a lot of things in the Atlanta area regarding the political campaigns. He was born in Savannah, Georgia, and his mother was the first female president of the synagogue in Savannah. So he has an interesting Judaic background too. So without further delay, I would like to just introduce Andrew Feiler, and I know that you will enjoy everything he has to say. Thank you for coming.
So I gave a talk earlier this morning where I was able to sort of really walk around the room, but we're on, courtesy of Malaprop books, we are online as well. So I have to sort of stay anchored in this part of the room. So I will feel free to be wandering, but within a kind of penalty box. This has been an extraordinary run. I have been a serious photographer most of my life. And about 10 years ago, I started down this path of taking my work more seriously and mercifully being taken more seriously. And my first photography book was published in 2015. That work had an accompanying museum exhibition. It traveled for 4.5 years to 9 different venues. And I took it down from its last venue, which was the Octagon Museum in Washington, DC, on February 28th of 2020. And it was amazing to think that I could actually just freely go to Washington and go to a museum, and now, boom, like a week later, we were done. This book came out in, supposedly on April 1st. We had all of the various launch activities that you have with the book, except there were no books. I had early experience what we all now call the supply chain crisis. My book is printed in China, and it was stuck in the port of LA. I had told my publisher, don't bring the book through the port of LA. I grew up in Savannah, Georgia. I know a little bit about ports. I know that there's all kinds of problems with the port of LA, and I don't know anybody in LA. If we have a problem in Savannah, I know who to call. It came to LA, got stuck for a month, but we have books, and this book was featured in this just exquisite double-page spread in the Wall Street Journal. It was in Smithsonian Magazine. Either of those are life moments for a photographer. It's been in Preservation Magazine, Architect Magazine. This book is in its 3rd printing. And so as a photography book, it's essentially been a bestseller. And the breaking news, which is not fully public, it is legal. The contract is signed, but it's not, it will, not on display yet. But in June, this work will become part of the permanent collection of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Light moment for a photographer. So I'm going to start with 2 premises. The first is that the Rosenwald Schools program is one of the most transformative developments in the first half of the 20th century. It dramatically reshapes this nation. It dramatically reshapes the African American experience. And yet it remains hidden history, and its scope and sweep is largely unknown. The second premise is that the relationship between Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington is one of the earliest collaborations between Blacks and Jews in the cause of what only later becomes known as civil rights. And there's a direct connection between the collaboration, the partnership, the friendship of Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, with his white beard flowing, marching arm in arm in the front lines with Dr. King, and who famously says, that when he marched with Dr. King, it felt like his feet were praying. And what happened in Georgia less than a year and a half ago, when filmmaker John Ossoff and Reverend Raphael Warnock crisscrossed the state of Georgia together for 2 months in a runoff election in Georgia, developing not just a close political alliance, but a deep personal friendship. I know both men well, and they do indeed have a very close personal friendship. That relationship Georgia sent its first Jewish senator and its first African-American senator to the United States Senate. That relationship between John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock stands on the shoulders of the relationship of Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington. Now, in my earlier book, there are some historic images. And I decided that for this body of work, I wanted consistency. And so I decided to shoot the historic images in place. So this is a photograph of a photograph. This is a portrait of Julius Rosenthal that hangs on the wall of the Noble Hill School in Bartow County, Georgia. Julius Rosenwald was born to Jewish immigrants who had fled religious persecution in Germany. And he grows up in Springfield, Illinois, across the street from Abraham Lincoln's home. In downtown, if you go to downtown Springfield today, there's a 4-square block Lincoln Home National Historical Site, where they have preserved the historic homes from that period of time. And across the street from Abraham Lincoln's home is Julius Rosenwald's childhood home. Peter Astley, who's the principal biographer of Julius Rosenwald, told me the story that when he was researching the biography, he went down and met with the superintendent of the National Historical Site, and he's sitting in his office and he says, "Do you know where Julius Rosenwald's childhood home was?" And the superintendent says to him, "You're sitting in it." At the time, there was not a plaque out in front of what is now the offices of the superintendent. There's a plaque today. And that plaque was placed there by the campaign to create a Julius Rosenwald and Rosenwald Schools National Historical Park. The vision of that campaign is that there would be a visitor center in Chicago and Rosenwald Schools in each of the 15 states in which there were Rosenwald Schools. It would be a multi-site national historical park. I serve on the advisory board of the campaign, and legislation, Dorothy Cantor, who runs this campaign, who is a force of nature, came up with this idea only in 2016, and in December of December of 2020, legislation cleared Congress requiring the Secretary of the Interior to do a feasibility study on this idea, and that's the critical step in moving forward with the new national component of the national park system. When this happens, and it will happen, this will be the first component of the United States national park system to honor a Jewish American. Now, Julius Rosenwald rises to become president of Sears Roebuck Company. They didn't have the term CEO back then. And with innovations like satisfaction guaranteed or your money back, he turns, I still remember that in gold letters above the transom doorway of the Sears store in Savannah. He turned Sears into the world's largest retailer of its era. And he also became one of the earliest and greatest philanthropists in American history. And his cause was what only later becomes known as civil rights. And he is motivated by his Judaism. He sees America as a safe haven for anti-Semitism, and he sees that safe haven weakened by how America treats her African-American citizens. He says, "I believe in America, but I do not see how America can go forward if part of her people are left behind." This is a portrait of Booker T. Washington that hangs above the mantle in the president's home of what is now Tuskegee University. Booker T. Washington, born into slavery in Virginia, goes to Hampton College, becomes an educator, and is the founding principal of the historically Black college in Alabama, originally known as Tuskegee Institute. Now, this is a rare photograph of the two men together, printed on fabric and sewn into a quilt to commemorate the restoration of Pine Grove School in Richland County, South Carolina. And at the rededication ceremony, former students, former teachers, and their descendants were invited to sign the quilt, and it hangs today in the restored schoolhouse. The image on the cover of my book is the restored classroom in this schoolhouse, and you can see this quilt in the back left-hand corner. Now, these two men met in 1911, May 18th, 1911. It's almost exactly 111 years ago. 111 years ago in a couple of days. And you have to remember, 1911 is before the Great Migration, which doesn't begin until later that decade. So 90% of African Americans live in the South. At the end of the Great Migration, in roughly 1970, 56% of African Americans live in the South. It's one of the largest internal displacements of people in human history. But in 1911, 90% of African Americans live in the South, and public schools for African Americans are mostly shacks, with a fraction of the funding provided for the education of white children. Many school jurisdictions do not even have public schools for African Americans. And so the two men come up with to create this program that becomes known as Rosenwald Schools. They did not name this program Rosenwald Schools. It does become known as Rosenwald Schools. And now, this is a photograph of students and teachers standing out in front of the Jefferson Jacobs School in Jefferson County, Kentucky. They reach out to the Black communities of the South, communities just like this. And they say, we want you to be a full partner in your progress. So if you will contribute to a school, and we will count as your contribution cash, land, material, or labor. And if you'll reach out to the school board, the white school board, because we want to be deliberate about creating Black-white dialogue as a vector for future progress, and these have to be public schools. We welcome the school system's contribution, but at a minimum, they have to agree to own, maintain, and staff the school, pay for the teachers. You do those two things, Julius Rosenthal will make a substantial contribution towards school construction. Now think about this. The Black community has to participate. This is one of the earliest examples of challenge grants in philanthropic history. The white school board has to participate. This is one of the earliest examples of public-private partnership. It's incredibly innovative. And the two men came up with this structure together. Now, I'm going to say one other thing about this image because it's important. It's important to the history of the program and relates to this body. Photography plays a critical role in the history of this program. The program began with a pilot of 6 schools, all close to Tuskegee, where Booker T. Washington and his team could keep an eye on. And Booker T. Washington has photographs made, just like this, of students and teachers standing out in front of their schools, carrying the hopes and dreams of their communities. Remember, the community had to contribute to the schoolhouse. A community already being taxed to pay for white schools. And they had to dig deeper to make these schools happen. He has these photographs made, sends them to Julius Rosenwald, who writes back that he is so moved he is committing to expand the program. Photographs just like this continue to be made throughout the entire history of the program. They are part of the visual language of the program, the visual history of the program. All of my bodies of work prior to this body of work have been in color. I shot this body of work not just in black and white, but horizontal, in recognition of the role that these historic images play in shaping this historic moment. The first community to raise the match is the Lochacoca community in Lee County, Alabama. Now I'm just going to pause and say, how do you make an historic marker interesting? So I get there and I'm actually out in front of this marker for about an hour and a half trying to figure out how to make this thing interesting. Now, fortunately, there was probably some sort of borrowed pit or something nearby because these dump trucks going back and forth were rather continuous. And so I had plenty of pictures of dump trucks and cars, doing different degrees of blur. And I'm sitting out there thinking, this is still just not that interesting. And after about an hour and 15 minutes, I hear the train whistle, and I'm like, problem solved. So this is the Lee County community. It's the first community, Logical community in Lee County, 1912. And from then to 1937, when President Franklin Roosevelt presides over the dedication of what is the last Rosenwald School, the Eleanor Roosevelt School in Meriwether County, Georgia, that's Warm Springs. 1912 to 1937, this program builds 4,978 schools across 15 states.
Would you repeat that?
What's that?
Would you repeat that statistic?
4,978 schools across 15 states from 1912 to 1937.
Wow.
And the results are transformative. Now, I'm going to talk about transformative in a second. But first, I want to tell you two stories about this schoolhouse. My wife and I purchased an old building in Atlanta, and my wife is a working artist and has been a working artist for 25 years, but she dusted off her old law school skills and did the research that led us to list our building on the National Register of Historic Places. I knew how valuable these forms were because I've written one of them. My process is to read and shoot, and to shoot and read, and the reading informs the shooting, and the shooting informs the reading. I read 41 books, I think is the number, hundreds of articles. And there are 100 Rosenwald schools listed on the National Register of Historic Places. I read 50 of those nomination forms. And this story that I'm about to tell you comes from the nomination form of this building, which is why these stories are so rich. Franklin Roosevelt, not yet president, 1929, sees Rosenwald Schools in Meriwether County, and he calls up the Rosenwald Fund and he says, we need more Rosenwald Schools in Meriwether County. It's 1929. The recession has set in, the school system is unable to contribute, the Black community is unable to contribute, so the idea languishes. The program actually formally ended in 1932. So actually 4,977 of these schools were built in 20 years, 1912 to 1932. The last Rosenwald School is 5 years later. In 1937, Franklin Roosevelt, now resident, calls up Edwin Embry at the Rosenwald Fund and says, I'm ready for my school. And Edwin Embry says, well, Mr. President, the program formally ended 5 years ago. But for you, Mr. President, we'll make an exception. So the Black community contributes, the white school system contributes, the Rosenwald Fund contributes, the WPA contributes. And the head of the WPA is in the Oval Office, meeting with President Roosevelt, reporting on various items. President Roosevelt asks about the status of the school, and the head of the WPA tells him they're $1,000 short. And in the Oval Office, President Roosevelt pulls out his checkbook and writes the $1,000 check that closes the gap. And later that year, he presides over the dedication of this school. Now, when this school closed in 1972, it was sold to a family in the cabinet business. They bricked up the windows and used it for storage. You can see at the moment that I was out and about shooting this work, the building was for sale. And I'm happy to report that courtesy of the work of the Georgia Trust for Historic Preservation, the building has been acquired with conservation easements put on it. And a brother and sister team are working now to restore the schoolhouse and turn it into a community center and museum. Now, I mentioned that the results were transformative. There are two economists from the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago who have done 5 studies of Rosenwald schools. And what their data shows is that prior to World War I, there was a large and persistent Black-white education gap in the South. You have to remember, literacy was outlawed during slavery. And the school systems set up by the Freedmen's Bureau during Reconstruction were largely shut down after Reconstruction. So there's this large and persistent Black-white education gap prior to World War I. Between World War I and World War II, that gap closes precipitously. And the single greatest driver of that achievement, and it's an achievement, is Rosenwald Schools. In addition, if you went to a Rosenwald school, your children were likely to have a higher level of educational attainment. So the effect is multi-generational. And if you went to a Rosenwald school, you actually had a higher likelihood of leaving the South as part of the Great Migration, which is a proxy for greater economic opportunity. And so this program had all kinds of positive economic effects and educational effects. In addition, many of the leaders and foot soldiers of the movement come through these schools. Medgar Evers, Maya Angelou, multiple members of the Little Rock Nine, who integrate Little Rock Central High, and Congressman John Lewis all went to Rosenwald Schools. Now, I grew up in Savannah, Georgia. I left the South after high school and went bouncing around the world for 15 years. I never thought I would come back to the South. I concluded that the South had grown up in my absence. In 1995, I moved back to Atlanta, and I was a constituent of Congressman Lewis's for 25 years. I'm very involved in the not-for-profit world of Atlanta, the political world of Atlanta. And so I reached out to Congressman Lewis and asked if he would write the introduction to this book. And he said to me, I'm not sure I'm comfortable writing about the history of the Rosenwald schools. I just know I went to school there. Now you got to remember, most of it, that is actually a very common statement among people who attended Rosenwald schools. The first generation who was to Rosenwald school, they had to raise the matching funds. But these schools were open for so long that that piece of the history and the narrative gets lost. Well, I was able to say to Congressman Lewis, I said, look, I will have an essay in the book. There are two prominent African-American preservationists that will have essays in this book. We will have the history covered. What I want you to do is what, Congressman Lewis, is what only you can do. Bring us into that classroom. What was it like to go to school there? What role did education play in your life? He said, oh, I can do that. And so it was on October 29th of 2019, I found myself in Congressman Lewis's Washington office at the round table in the middle of this space with this virtual civil rights museum on the walls of all of his images and mementos of the movement, working with him on the introduction to this book. His staff had let me in, he was on the floor voting, and they had let me into his office to set up my lights. And so when we stood up to, after working on the introduction, his jacket had been draped behind the chair, and he stood up and put the jacket on. And you see there's this cancer awareness ribbon on his lapel, and he said, should I take the ribbon off? I said, Congressman Lewis, I want the authentic you, and that is the authentic you, leave it on. And it was exactly 60 days later, on October 29th of 2019, that Congressman Lewis went public with a pancreatic cancer diagnosis that would take his life in the middle of the next year. I want to say a couple things about this image, because you're going to see some other portraits as an illustration about how I approach the portraits that are part of this book. I will start by simply saying there are 85 photographs in this book. 21 of those are portraits. There are 40, some of those are multiple people, and there are 47 people portrayed in this book. 5 of them have since died, including Congressman Lewis. This is a memory and history are perishable resources, and it's incumbent upon all of us to help keep those histories and stories and memories alive. Congressman Lewis's staff reached out to me in this process and said, can we shoot this photograph in the Atlanta office? And somewhat boldly, I said, no. Because to me, it was the location of these images is part of the story. I wanted to shoot this photograph in the Washington office because that was a statement of power and a statement of achievement. In addition, I never told anybody what to wear because I wanted them to be authentic. And I didn't tell anybody what expressions to put on their faces because I wanted them to have agency and how they helped me tell their connection to this story. And you'll see that in the other portraits that are here. Now, this is the Emory School in Hale County, Alabama, likely the oldest surviving Rosenwald school from about 1915, the early years of the program. The records aren't quite as precise. And the oldest, probably the only one that I have seen, a surviving example of the first Rosenwald school design. Now, I had never heard of Rosenwald Schools until February of 2015, when I found myself at lunch with a woman named Jeannie Syriac, who originated the role of African American Cultural Heritage Specialist at the Georgia State Historic Preservation Office. And she's the first person to tell me about Rosenwald Schools, and the story shocked me. I'm a fifth generation Jewish Georgian. I have been a progressive activist my entire life. The pillars of this story: Southern, progressive, activist, are the pillars of my life. How could I have never heard of Rosenwald School? So I came home and I Googled Rosenwald School, and I found that there were a number of books on the topic, but there was not a comprehensive photographic account of the program. So I set out to do exactly that. I had turned this is February 2015. In December of 2014, I had turned my first book into my publisher. It would not come out until October of 2015. I was thinking about what I was going to do next. And so I began this journey. And over 3.5 years, as Sally said, I drove 25,000 miles across all 15 of the program states. I will tell you that when I added it up at the end, I thought there was an error in my math, because I couldn't have possibly driven, until I was talking about publisher, I think I driven 10,000 miles. It was 25,000 miles. Of the original 4,978 schools, only about 500 survived. Only about half of those have been restored. I shot 105 of the surviving schools. And the result is this story. Now I'm going to take you inside the Emory School, because I want to talk about the architectural idiom of these schools. But to do that, I have to tell you the story of Robert Robinson Taylor. Robert Robinson Taylor was the first African-American to attend MIT, the first accredited African-American architect, the great-grandfather of Valerie Jarrett, long a fixture in Chicago public policy circles and a principal advisor and mentor to President Obama during his tenure in the White House. Robert Robinson Taylor is hired by Booker T. Washington to be the chief architect at Tuskegee. If you go to Tuskegee today, which in itself is the campus is a national historical site, many of the beautiful buildings on that campus were designed by Robert Robinson Taylor. And he leads the team of architects that lays out the architectural language of Rosenwald Schools. These large banks of windows on the left, these 9-over-9 pane windows to let in lots of light, because the schoolhouses originally did not have electricity. They actually, each schoolhouse plan, floor plan, had 2 different plans based on how the windows were, or how the building was sited on the land, whether it was a north-south or an east-west orientation, so that the windows could be optimized for the light. And I will actually add that one of my sort of small contributions to the literature of the history of these programs is the observation that the Rosenwald specifications were, they were to be optimized so that light would come over the left shoulder of the students. So when they were writing, there would be no shadow. Recognize that there's an implicit assumption there that everybody was right-handed. So large windows on the left, cloak rooms on the right, so that dirty outer garments could be kept separate and not sully the education spaces. Brick chimneys to vent the potbelly stoves that kept the schoolhouse warm on winter days. And you see toward the back of the space a room divider. That room divider would have originally had in it a series of doors that could be closed off to separate the education spaces, or accordioned back to create a unified space that could serve as a community center outside of education hours. So this idea of public infrastructure having multiple uses is designed in from the very beginning. Schoolhouse as community center. This is progressive era architecture in service to education. Now, this is what is known as a one-teacher school. This is a two-teacher school. James Hope was the state school superintendent in South Carolina, who was so committed to the Rosenwald Schools program that every county in South Carolina had a Rosenwald School, at least one. His family all but donated the 2 acres of land for this school, sold it for $5, which even in 1926 was a virtual donation. And the community therefore named the school in his honor, the Hope School. The school closes in 1954, it fell into disrepair, and Ron Hope, the grandnephew of James Hope, who had a career as an Army officer, retired back to Palmyra, South Carolina, and he said, you know, I have a pension from the people of the United States. What can I do to give back? And he single-handedly, literally single-handedly restored this schoolhouse. If you go today to the National Museum of African American History and Culture on National Mall, you will find from this schoolhouse 6 school desks, 1 potbelly stove, and the original sign proclaiming Hope School. Now, this is what's known as a 2-teacher school. This is a 3-teacher school, the Pleasant Plains School in Harper County, North Carolina. And now, the architectural idiom of the architectural guidelines of the Rosenwald Schools program was that the schools were to be modest. That was in part to save cost, and in part to avoid attracting the ire, otherwise known as arson, for the local white citizenry. There was also a rule that there should be no pupil. I sort of affectionately call that the no doodads rule.
Could you repeat that? Repeat that?
I'm sorry?
What was it? No.
No doodads.
Doodads.
That little appendage on the top of the schoolhouse is a pupil. One of the architectural leaders of the Rosenwald Schools program believed that a cupola was derivative of church architecture, and on a schoolhouse it violated separation of church and state. Now, I've been to 105 Rosenwald schools. 3 of them had cupolas, including one that we know that Julius Rosenthal visited, because the photograph of that building in the archive was actually shot by Julius Rosenthal. That's the school on the campus of Fort Valley State University, and just south of Macon. So how did the schoolhouse get a pupil? Remember, the African American community has to contribute, and that contribution can be cash, land, material, or labor. This cupola is African American Community Agency in Jim Crow, North Carolina of 1920. I'm going to show you another striking example of that in a minute. Now, notice we've seen 1, 2, 3-teacher schools, small white clapboard structures. By the end of the program, they're building 1, 2, and 3-story red brick buildings. This is the Dunbar School in Pulaski County, Arkansas, otherwise known as Little Rock. Now, I knew this was an amazing story. It was not clear how I would tell it visually. And I started with some test shoots with Jeannie Syriac, and I would go out to various schools across Georgia. But my exhibition of my work from my first book was traveling at the time. And at the time I was getting started on this work, it was about to open at the International Civil Rights Center and Museum in Greensboro, North Carolina, which is in the old Woolworths, where the lunch counter city movement begins February 1st, 1960, surprisingly early in this history. And so I would research Rosenwald schools. I would find them by GPS, I would find GPS coordinates, and I would take these I loaded up the exhibition in the back of my wife's SUV, and I would drive the back roads all the way up to Greensboro, shooting Rosenwald schools all the way up, hang the exhibition, open the exhibition, shoot schools all the way back. My wife, by the way, can't stand it when I say shoot schools, but it is what I do. And then 4 months later, I would take the exhibition down, and I'd move this on. Those images were all exterior images. Now, a lot of those schools were abandoned and not restored. And I realized that the historic preservation imperative was at the center of this story. And that meant I had to tell the adaptive reuse narrative, because you see, some of this school is still an active middle school, but of the 105 schools I went to, only 5 were still in use for educational purposes. Most of them were too small. These schoolhouses were small because the African American community was not afforded school buses. So they had to have each school served a smaller radius because the students had to walk to school. So they can't be used, they've outgrown their use as educational institutions, and so they had to be adaptively reused to be saved. And many of them have been turned into church halls or community centers, private homes, apartment buildings. In Turin, Georgia, one of them is City Hall. And to tell the adaptive reuse story, I suddenly needed permission. And that's when I meet all of these extraordinary people, former students, former teachers, preservationists, civic leaders, and it's the portraiture that I bring their stories into this story. Now, I have two more things. Something is from this school, what was at the time a middle school, Dunbar. It is from Dunbar that several members of the Little Rock Nine go to become members of the Little Rock Nine. And Little Rock Central High is 1 mile from the schoolhouse. And if the schoolhouse looks vaguely familiar with its Art Deco detailing, it's because the architect of Little Rock Central High was the same architect of the Dunbar School. These are the Pleasant Hill quilters. 3 of these women had parents that attended Rosenwald Schools. 3 of them attended Rosenwald Schools. And LaJoyce Flanagan, who's in the front row in the center, was a teacher in this school. When the schoolhouse closed and fell into disrepair, these women decided that they would lead the effort to restore the schoolhouse. And they sold quilts to raise the money to create what is now the Pleasant Hill Community Center. And these women gather in the schoolhouse on most Mondays to quilt. And I will add that we commissioned them to do a quilt, which is the bedspread in our house. This is another example of a community center. This is the Lincoln School in Bledsoe County, Tennessee. And notice the extraordinary pressed tin that covers all the walls and ceilings. I'm not aware of any other Rosenwald school that has this. Another phenomenal example of African-American community agency, this time in 1926, Jim Crow, Tennessee, and the pride that this community had in its schoolhouse. The Denby School, this is in Tidewater, Virginia. Now, the Denby School has this extraordinary story, but what I want to do is use this image to talk a little bit about my process. Jeannie Syriac crisscrossed the state of Georgia a decade before I was doing this work. And she found 37 Rosenwald schools and did what's called a multi-site listing for the National Register. It's important because if another Rosenwald school is found within that area of the register, in this case, the state of Georgia, then it can simply be added to the list. It's very easy to get a new school added to the National Register. As she would remind me with some frequency, she did this without the internet. I would get on the internet, but one of the things that I was looking for was how the schoolhouse, Google Maps and Street View are phenomenal tools. It was important to figure out which way the schoolhouse was oriented, because if it faces east, for example, you don't want to show up in the evening, you'll be backlit. If it faces west, you don't want to show up in the morning, you'll be in shadow. And so I found that this schoolhouse faced west. So I knew I needed to be there in the afternoon. Now, by the way, unless there's cloud cover, I love clouds. Clouds are interesting. Clouds muffle the light. And I had one day to shoot this schoolhouse, and I had to be back in Washington for dinner that night. And I knew that it faced west, so in the morning the light was going to be terrible, and there were no clouds, but the clouds were coming in at about 1:30. So I drive down there. I've got to leave at 3:30 to get back to Washington. And I get to the schoolhouse at 10:30, and I sit in front of the schoolhouse. And about 1:30, the clouds start to come in. And I'm thinking, okay, 2 o'clock, we're going to be good. At 5 minutes to 2, a car pulls up and parks right in front of me. So I drive over there across the actually very big street, like a 6-lane street between where I was parked in the schoolhouse. And I knock on the door. It's the pastor. So I explained to him what I'm doing, and he's incredibly gracious, and he brings me in, he shows me around, and he tells me this story. Beatrice Combs was a student in this schoolhouse, and when it closed, she and her husband bought the schoolhouse and immediately got into a fight. He wanted to turn it into a bar. She said over my dead body. It's a 2-teacher school. They rent it out to 2 families. But Beatrice Combs joins a new Congregationalist church that is meeting at a strip center. And in the words of her daughter, the pastor put me in touch with her daughter and son, who I interviewed. In the words of her daughter, she accepted the Lord. And so they allowed the church to start meeting in the schoolhouse. They eventually sold the schoolhouse to the church. The church thrived. They added on there. Beatrice Combs was a member of this church. She was actually the secretary of the church, and she served as an usher in the church services her entire life. Her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren today are members of this church. And her portrait hangs in the old schoolhouse, which is now the Beatrice Combs Fellowship Hall. And the pastor did agree to move his car. This is this beautiful portrait of Abraham Lincoln on the wall of the Warfield School in Montgomery County, Tennessee. This schoolhouse is named after the man. There was a previous school on this location, which was destroyed in a tornado. And the local person who led the fundraising effort to provide the community match was a man named Warfield. And in appreciation, the community named the schoolhouse after him. And you see over this image the reflection of these 9/9 pane windows, this iconic element of Rosenwald Schools architecture. And yet there are schools like this. The Hannah School in Newberry County, South Carolina, across the street from the Hannah AME Church, the namesake of the school. The graveyard has grown up around the schoolhouse in the kind of detail that you can never make up. The schoolhouse rises on Deadfall Road. But you see, the schoolhouse is in great distress, at risk of collapse. And when we lose these types of structures, we lose a piece of the American soul, because this is the locus of history and memory. And so there is an inherent plea in this body of work to preserve those surviving Rosenwald schools. And indeed, in the course of my travels, I came across schools that had collapsed so recently. They were surrounded by emergency fencing or yellow caution tape. This is the W.E.B. Du Bois School that was demolished a week before I got there because it had become unstable. And you see this Coke machine standing sentinel, like a Sherman sentinel in the midst of this rubble. I will add that when I pulled up, there were actually 2 buzzards on the Coke machine, but they were not very respectful of photographers. But as we discussed, the heart and soul of the story is the people that I met. This is Frank and Charles Brinkley inside the K. Rose School in Sumner County, Tennessee. This portrait of Julius Rosenwald has hung on the wall since the schoolhouse opened in 1923. I'm going to briefly tell you how I got to these men is illustrative of the work that I do. This is it's known as a Model 1A schoolhouse, of which Mars Hill is another example. I had not yet shot a 1A schoolhouse, and I was very specifically looking for it because it was a common model. And I found this photograph online of the K. Rose School while it was being renovated. It has one of those big signs up where everybody who's involved with the renovation gets their name on the sign. And so I plucked out the name of the architect, and I called the architect, told him what I was doing, and he said, "You need to talk to Frank Brinkley." So this is Frank Brinkley on the left, his brother Charles. They both were students in this school. Their dad, it's a 1-teacher school, was both principal and teacher. They both went to college. They both went to graduate school. Frank actually has 2 graduate degrees, one from Tuskegee. They both became educators. Frank became a high school math and science teacher. Charles became a middle school principal. They have 4 sisters, all of whom went through this school, all of whom went to college. And these 6 siblings had 10 children. All 10 children went to college. That legacy may not have happened were it not for this schoolhouse. This is the Bay Springs School in Forest County, Mississippi. To tell you the story of this school, I have to tell you the story of Vernon Damer Sr. Vernon Damer Sr.'s grandfather donated the 2 acres of land to the school, and Vernon Damer was a student of the school. When the schoolhouse closed in 1958, because the state of Mississippi had built a larger consolidated school. Think about this, 1958, 4 years after Brown v. Board, the state of Mississippi is building new segregated schools. The schoolhouse closed in 1958. The grandfather had been smart enough to build in a reversionary clause. So the schoolhouse reverted to Vernon Damer, who turned it into a locus of civil rights activists. SNCC met here, the NAACP met here, and Vernon Damer, who was the head of the NAACP in Forest County, Mississippi, when he drove African Americans into Hattiesburg to attempt to register to vote, he would have them parked behind the schoolhouse so they could not be identified by their vehicles and harassed. Their son Dennis told me this story that on July 4th of 1964, Freedom Summer, the Damer family threw a picnic for the voter registration volunteers, white and black. And Dennis was 11 years old at the time, so it's the first time he had seen blacks and whites socialize together. Now, all of this, as you can imagine, drew the ire of the KKK on the night of January 10th, 1966. Vernon Damer's home, which is right on the other side of the trees and right of this image, was firebombed by 4 members of the KKK, including the Grand Wizard. Vernon Damer stood in the front window of his living room with a gun trying to hold off the attackers while his wife Ellie got their children out the back door. And Vernon Damer died as a result of his injuries from that fire. This is inside the Bay Spring School. This is Ellie Damer. Ellie Damer attended a different Rosenwald school in Mississippi. She went off to college. She became an educator. She taught in this school. And when the schoolhouse closed in 1958, she had to reapply for her job at the consolidated school, and she was denied employment because of her husband's activism. And she had to get a job at a school district 35 miles away, and she taught there for 21 years. Now, this is the last schoolhouse I'll show you. This is another example of a one-page school. This is the Hopewell School in Bastrop County, Texas. At the moment this image is taken, this schoolhouse is in the midst of restoration, and this is inside. Notice the mottled nature of the walls. That's primer. The plastic sheeting on the floor, the potbelly stove on the right is wrapped in plastic. The photograph in the middle of this image was taken in the 19th century. That is Sophia and Martin McDonald, both of whom were born into slavery. And upon emancipation, they began raising farm animals. They acquired some land, they acquired some more land, they eventually acquired 1,200 acres. And when the Rosenwald Schools program came to Bastrop County, Texas in 1919, the family donated 2 acres of land for the school. Its first teacher was their daughter. One of her first students was her daughter, Sophia Williams, shown on the right here holding this portrait of her grandparents. Her husband, Elroy Williams, went to a different Rosenwald school in Bastrop County. They both went off to college, and they both came back and had entire careers as educators in Bastrop County, and now they have been leading this effort to restore the schoolhouse and turn it into a museum and community center. I will add that they live around the corner from the schoolhouse. And the person who had actually let me into the schoolhouse was from the Community Foundation of Austin, Greater Austin. This is about an hour outside of Austin. And he said to me, to understand the schoolhouse, you have to meet Elroy and Sophia Williams. So he just took me over to their home. It was a freezing day. It was like 12 degrees out. And they ushered me in through the carport and into their warm kitchen. I sat around with them for an hour or so as they were telling me the story. And Sophia Williams quietly gets up and leaves the room. And she comes in with this photograph. And my jaw drops. And I'm like, what? And so after I regained my composure, I said to them, okay, I realize it is brutally cold out. But can we please go over to the schoolhouse and let me take your portrait inside holding up this photograph? And they're like, sure. So that's the backstory of how this. But this is why stories like this This is actually in photography terms known as a hybrid body. A lot of bodies of photography stand only on the images. But I came across Rosenwald Schools directly connected to the Trail of Tears, to the Tuskegee syphilis study, to the Tuskegee Airmen, to the litigation case of Brown v. Board, that I felt compelled to tell these stories. And so I've written a short story. I had a self-imposed cap of 250 words. I violated it twice. Because it was necessary to bring these stories into this work. And so it's a story that goes with almost every image, in some cases pairs of images. So I hope you'll spend time with these images, but I hope you also spend time with the stories, because I think you'll be moved and inspired and a little more confident about the possibility of change in America. I'm going to tell you one more story, and that is this work is about Rosenwald Schools. But there is another component of the Rosenwald legacy that is too important to leave out, and that is the Rosenwald Fellowships. From 1928 to 1948, the Rosenwald Fund gave fellowships to intellectuals and creatives. 278 of those grants went to liberal white Southerners like newspaper editor Ralph Gill, playwright Lillian Smith, but 587 of them went to African-American intellectuals and creatives. It is a veritable who's who of African-American intellectual life in the 20th century. Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Marian Anderson, the Clarks, and Gordon Parks was the first African-American photographer to be awarded a Rosenwald grant. Now, Gordon Parks has long been one of my inspirations in the field of photography. It is from Gordon Parks that I learned that art can be activism. And I had the great privilege of spending some time with Gordon Parks in 1993 when he was on book tour for his memoir, Voices in Here. Roll forward to today in Atlanta, and somewhat strangely, we are friends with Gordon Parks' daughter, Leslie Parks Bailey. So I called up Leslie and I said, okay, Leslie, I'd like to tell your dad's story through perhaps a portrait of you holding a photograph by your dad and his connection to the Rosenwald program, Rosenwald Fellowship. She said, that's a great idea. She puts me in touch with the Gordon Parks Foundation. They immediately emailed me this image, and they say this self-portrait was part of Gordon Parks' application to the Rosenwald Fund. I said, that will do. Leslie's a yoga instructor, so that was part of the image. Though I didn't tell her what to wear, she chose that. I mentioned that earlier. But what I did decide from the very beginning is I wanted to shoot this on a manhole copy. Because one of Gordon Parks' seminal bodies of photography was a photo illustration he did for Life magazine in 1952 of Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, with the invisible man coming out from under a manhole. And so that is the reference here. So I will, I'm going to close on a sort of personal observation. As Sally mentioned, I come to this work as an activist. As I went down this path, trying to find my voice as a photographer, I realized that my voice as an artist was my civic voice. And there is one particular component of this story which really jumps out. Julius Rosenthal and Booker T. Washington are building schools for African Americans in the Jim Crow South of 1912. That is a deeply optimistic act. That is a multi-generational act. They were playing long ball. And I find great power in this idea of this combination of the power of optimism and long-term thinking. And in fact, this is one of the hallmarks of the messages of Congressman John Lewis. He would say with great frequency, be hopeful, be optimistic. Our work is not the work of a day, a life, a week, or a year. It is the work of a lifetime. I still remember the first time I heard that. I was stunned. Congressman Lewis, for everything he had been through, could continue to be so optimistic. But that is this power of being engaged in the public square and being optimistic and playing long ball. So I will close on that particular thought of be optimistic, think long term, and in the immortal words of Congressman Lewis, make good trouble. Thank you very much. I am happy to take questions. I have to stay in the box. Yes, ma'am.
The big school that you showed us, I think it was Little Rock.
Yes.
How small was that originally? What part of that was in the original school?
That building is the original school.
That whole huge
That whole school,
building?
yeah. Okay, so this gets into the kind of geeky detail. There was a tension. So the Rosenwald Fund did not take a position on curriculum, but there was a tension in pedagogy circles at the time as to whether to teach what was called classical education, reading, writing, arithmetic, or what was called industrial education. Today we would call OTAC. In 1930, the Rosenwald Fund experiments with a couple of large schools in urban areas that were designed to focus on industrial education. There were 4 of them. 2 of them remain, this one and one in Winston-Salem. They were a complete failure because, as you can imagine, if there is a debate about industrial education versus classical education, the urban areas, those parents wanted their kids having classical education. And so the program basically was a failure, and they had to abandon the idea that these were going to be schools for industrial education. But it was a 4-building experiment. It happened to be right on the cusp of the program ending in 1932. They didn't know that at the time, but that's where it was heading. But that's why it's a larger building. Now, there's another building in my school, also a Dunbar school, same name, in Fort Myers. There's a beautiful 2-story mission architecture building. So why would the Rosenwald Fund deviate and permit mission architecture? It's because they had built a brand new white school and they used the same architectural plans to save money. And that schoolhouse is also, because it's so large, still in use for educational purposes. But that was an anomaly of simply saving money. Yes, ma'am.
How did you choose which school to photograph?
I'm sorry?
How did you choose which school to photograph?
So at the beginning, I was kind of opportunistic. I would shoot just about any school I could find. I shot 105 schools, 53 made the cut to the book. But what started to happen was that I realized that I was actually telling 2 narratives. There's what I call a horizontal narrative. 1 teacher school, 2 teacher school, 3 teacher schools, and the program they're building 1, 2, 3-story regular buildings, right? So how the history of the program changes over time. And then there's what I call the vertical narrative, how each individual school and personal story moves along the central narrative and complements. So what I was looking for was telling both a comprehensive horizontal narrative and a series of diverse, interesting individual narratives. And there were certain stories that I needed to tell. I needed to tell an adaptive reuse narrative. I needed, and then I would find schools that had these interesting connections. So school connected to the Tuskegee Simple study clearly was going to be an important story. School connected to Trail of Tears, very important story. And so it just sort of unfolded. And I by the end, I kind of had a checklist of 20 images that I wanted, and I got about 11 of those. And then I realized, you know, I do not have a school converted to a private home. I had this vision of the shooting living room with 9 or 9 pane windows. Never got it. It's because the people that actually live in these want privacy, and they're actually much harder to find because of that. But I ended up, I think, with a series of images that tell the whole story.
I actually want to cry right now. I'm from Alabama. My mom and my aunt, First Lady Shelley Gates, we're originally from Alabama. I'm from Butler County, Alabama, which is Greenville, Alabama. I used to play in one schoolhouse. There's a schoolhouse on my grandfather's land in Butler County, Alabama. And so as I see those pictures, I shed tears because we didn't have, nobody told us that these schools were for, we didn't know. So my toys, my mom can vouch for my toys, all of, we use it as storage. And it's still on the property in Butler County, Alabama. It has caved in. And it's overwhelming. It's overwhelming. And I thank you for doing this and bringing your light and using what you are doing to help the world, because everybody didn't know.
Well, thank you. I'd say two things. Number one, this is what I did. I use photographs to bring people into stories that they would not otherwise have access to. There's a lot of people that are not going to read a long book on this history. In fact, we were at dinner last night, somebody had read Peter Astley's biography and commented on how dry it is. I'm a geeky historian, right? I like that kind of thing, but not everybody's going to read a 600-page biography of Julius Rosenthal. By having this book, by having this museum show, I'm going to come back to that about mentioning museum show. It brings people into the story. This other thing that I would say is, first of all, one thing I've learned about shooting in abandoned spaces, and I've shot a lot in abandoned spaces, you can do a lot to restore a building as long as the roof is intact. Once the roof goes, the building can go very quickly. But if there's a possibility of saving the structure, there is a relatively new entity that is under the umbrella of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. It's called the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund. They do 2 rounds. Brent Leggs, who's the executive director of the Action Fund, wrote the afterword to my book. His portrait is in the book. Both of his parents went to Rosenwald Schools. His portrait is on the empty lot where the school was, where his father's school had been. The Action Fund does 2 grant rounds per year, and there's always at least one Rosenwald school in that funding. And the Action Fund helped fund Mars Hill, the restoration of Mars Hill. So I would encourage you to reach out to them. So the exhibition, there is an exhibition accompanying this work. There's 85 images in the book. There's 23 prints in the exhibition. 20 of them are printed large. And it originated at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights in Atlanta, where it was up for the latter half of last year. It is now at the Charlotte Museum of History, where it is up for June 18th. It will then go to the Do Good Fund Gallery in Columbus, Georgia, the National Civil Rights Museum of Lorraine Motel in Memphis, the State of Tennessee Museum in Nashville, the Filson in Louisville, Kentucky, the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience in New Orleans, which just opened last year, a fabulous museum, the Virginia Museum of History and Culture in Richmond. That takes me through the end of 2024. And this summer, I'm going to start booking 2025, 2026. Yes, ma'am.
We have a question from the at-home audience.
Yeah.
Well-timed, because you just mentioned Virginia. We have someone who's asking about Rosenwald Schools in Virginia and if any of them have been restored.
I didn't hear the second part of the question.
If any of them have been restored.
Oh, yeah. There are, well, the Denby School, which I showed in this presentation, is in Tidewater, Virginia. There are the St. Paul School, which is actually in a pine barren right off of a highway, kind of in the middle of nowhere. It's in my book as well. It has also been restored. But I will add that one of the most important schools in Virginia is not yet restored. So it's a little complicated story. But what was originally called the Farmville County Training School in Farmville, Virginia, was a 11-teacher school. It's a 2-story brick building. They renamed it the Moton School after the person who succeeded Booker T. Washington as head of Tuskegee. The school got overcrowded. They built a brand new school across the street. The name Moton went with that. That became Moton High. They renamed the previous Moton School, which became the elementary school that fed the high school. And Moton High walks into history. It's one of the 4 cases that become known as Brown v. Board. We know Brown v. Board actually was 4 jurisdictions. It's known as the Brown case because it was alphabetically the first one. But it's Topeka, Kansas, Wilmington, Delaware, Clarendon County, South Carolina, and Farmville, Virginia. Those are the 4 cases. Moton High, across the street, has now been restored and is a museum to the Brown case. But the old Farmville County Training School is falling apart, including having a hole in the roof. In fact, when I was there and I was talking to people, I'm like, I don't care what you do, you got to plug that hole in the roof or you're going to have no options. I understand now that there is an effort through the Action Fund to stabilize, at least stabilize the building and hopefully restore it in the future. But that case is that case is there. So yes. Okay, thank you all for being here.